Hey folks, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to compress your snare drum for more attack. We're going to be talking about compression today, but before we dive in, if you're ready to go a little bit further into the process of crafting great drum sounds, then I have just the thing for you. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum. It's a simple PDF that will guide you through the entire process of recording snare drum. We're going from which microphones to use, to mic placement, to all of the different techniques I use to get a great snare drum sound. It is completely free, and you can download it using the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and talk about compressing snare drum. Compression can be a scary thing, especially on snare drum, especially on kick drum. It's very easy, if you set your settings wrong, to completely squash your drum and neuter the tone, especially on snare drum. It's easy to overdo it and suck all the life out of your drum. Let me play you the snare drum inside the full mix, and then I'll solo up the drums so you can hear the snare drum melding with the rest of the drums, so you can see that we're not sucking all the life, sucking all the tone out of our drum by putting this compressor on. We're actually getting a little bit more attack and a little bit more crack from our drum while tightening up the tone a little bit. So here's the full mix, and then I'll solo up our drums here.
Stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time.
You can hear our snare drum's got a nice pop to it, and it's still got a nice little bit of that crackle up on top. We can still hear our bottom snare shining through, but it's not so crazy, it's not so loose sounding, and it's not so dull or flat sounding. We have that emphasis on that attack, and that's coming from our compressor here. Let me solo up our snare drum, and we'll do a before and after on this compressor, and you can hear what it's adding and what it's bringing to life in our snare drum, instead of, again, neutering our sound or just completely obliterating our tone and our attack. Pay attention to how much compression we're doing, and look up here and see how we're kind of following with our snare drum in time. You can see our meters moving in time with our drum, and we're doing about 6 dB of compression here. What the compressor is giving us is a little bit of control on our drum, while also emphasizing the initial transient or the initial attack of the drum. We're getting that from our attack and release section here. We have our attack set so the compressor doesn't engage till after that initial transient or after that initial spike on our snare drum. That's allowing that attack to come through. That's giving us our emphasis on our attack point. And then our release is set so it lets go in time with the snare drum. That gives us that little breathing effect that feels like our snare drum's moving with our compressor, or our compressor's moving in time with our snare drum, That's what's tightening up our snare drum a little bit, so it doesn't sound so loose and the top end doesn't sound so messy on it, right? We get a little bit of control, so we get that nice pop from our attack, and we get that nice crack up top. It doesn't sound so loose or unfocused. One more time, we'll do a before and after, and then I'm going to pull in a compressor and do it from scratch so you can kind of see how we set these attack and release settings to get it to move in time with our snare drum. We'll start with out this time, and then we'll kick it back in. If you notice down here as well, if we watch our level meter, it feels like the snare drum is louder without the compressor in, but we're sitting at about the same levels. The reason being is when we have the compressor in, we're emphasizing that front attack. So we're getting the same level out of the snare drum without it seeming as loud. That allows us to keep it further up in the mix so it can compete with our kick drum without having to push or pull the level down so much because our snare drum is so huge and loose sounding, right? So our attack allows us to pull our snare drum up a little bit higher in the mix because we're conserving that level, but it's more attack rather than looser tone of the snare drum as a whole. Now let's pull in a compressor here and kind of do this from scratch so you can see how we're getting these attack and release settings. So we'll turn off this first one. When I pull in the compressor, these are the default settings, so it's usually pretty close to where I want on a kick or a snare drum. That's why I have these default settings. So 30 millisecond attack, 120 millisecond release is a great place to start on kick drum and on snare drum. It's going to get you close to where you want to be to get that nice attack and that nice pop from your snare drum. So we're going to pull the threshold down and then adjust our attack and release settings. That's kind of how you want to start to get it to move in time. If you pull your threshold down, you'll see your compressor working, and then you can set your attack and release settings so it's working in time with your drum. So that's not bad there, but as I'm hearing it and as I'm watching the meter here, it's not quite fast enough. I want it to be a little bit faster. Our snare drum's going to be faster than a kick drum would be, or a overhead setting, right? You want your overheads and your kick drum probably a little bit slower. You don't want to go so aggressive. Here we're going to go a little bit more aggressive because the snare drum's a more aggressive instrument. And then the release seems a little bit too slow to me. It seems like it's holding on a little bit too much for what I want for this drum sound. So there's the pop I want from the snare, right? I don't want to go any further with our attack because we'll probably start neutering our sound. But let me show you what that would sound like. So we go too far here, and then our attack's gone, right? We're compressing the entirety of the snare drum sound. There's no room for that initial transient to pop through. So let's go back to where we were. Right there is nice for me. That's a nice amount of attack. We're not neutering the sound. We're not going too far. You heard the further I went up, the faster I took the attack, the more of the attack we lost. And then as I slowed it down, you felt that attack, that initial transient come in. Now let's get our release set right here. It's a little bit too long for me. The releases, it's a little bit too slow. It's holding on too long to the snare drum. I'm going to show you both. So I'm going to go a little bit faster with our release, so it lets go a little bit faster and moves a little bit more in time with our initial transient or with our spike on our snare drum. And then I'll show you what happens if we go too slow. So it's going to hold on to our snare drum, which is going to really tighten the sound. That I like right there. So we hear our compressor go in, you can see it go in, we can see our amount of compression go in, but then it lets go right away as the snare drum dissipates, and it gives room for the actual snares or the bottom snare to come up. So we get a little bit of that nice crackle on the bottom, which is nice. Let's go the opposite way and tighten our snare drum even further. So now our compressor is holding on even after our initial energy from our snare is gone. It holds on till our next snare hit comes in, and sometimes even further, which gives us a really tight snare drum sound, but we're losing that little bit of energy, that little bit of crackle and shine we get after our snare has let go, which is our bottom snares coming up, which I like. I want that in this mix, and I want a little bit of that extra resonance we're getting. If you don't, pull that release back. We're still getting our attack, but you want to make sure the compressor lets go before the next snare hit. Otherwise, you're going to be reaching into the next snare attack and neutering your next hit. So you'll have one good hit, and then the rest of them will kind of all fall together. That's sounding good there. Let's make sure we're doing the right amount of compression, and we'll pull up our gain a little bit. That sounds good to me. Let's put it in with our kick here and get it leveled out with our kick drum. I usually like to level my snare drum with my kick drum, so they're kind of working in tandem here. Sounds good. Let's see how close we got here. If we pull back up our other compressor, looks pretty close. If we turn that on, so this one looks a little bit faster, but we're at about the same threshold and we're at the same attack. So all we had it was a little bit faster, so it lets go a little bit faster. Let's go back to our initial one, see what we have in our drum sound. Yeah, we're preserving a little bit more of that ring and that resonance on the back end, which blends nicely into this bigger live drum sound. So your release is your preference. You want to set your attack so you let that initial transient pop through, and how much you leave in is up to you. The faster you go, the more of the attack you're going to pull out. And then on your release, that's preference on how you want the drum to sound. The slower your release, the higher the number, the tighter your drum's going to sound. The longer you're going to hold on to your snare drum. You just want to make sure it lets go before your next snare hit. The faster you go, the more you're going to leave on the back end of your snare drum. So here, we're leaving it fast enough that we get some of that resonance on the back end of the snare drum, and we hear some of those snares on the bottom, the snare energy, come up a little bit. Let's put it into the full mix one more time, and we will finish up here.
Stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in time, don't get out of line. Oh boy, stay in.
You can hear without the compressor in, the snare isn't quite competitive enough to sit with the rest of the drums or with the rest of the mix. We kick our compressor in, we get that extra pop by emphasizing the attack on our drum, and we tighten the sound up a little bit so it isn't so loose sounding up on the top end. I hope that was helpful for you. Like I said, if you're ready to level up your drum tones and really start dialing in your snare recording process, then I have just a tool for you, and it is completely free. It's my essential guide to recording snare drum. You can download it below and start creating more professional sounding recordings in less time.